Very much. I hope everybody can hear me now. Okay. Thank you very much, Patrick, for your very kind words. It is good to see you here. Let me begin by thanking the conference organizers. In particular, I would like to thank Professor Jing Zhao, who very kindly invited me to give this keynote. We have been in touch for many years. Unfortunately, it could not work out in the previous years, but sometimes distance is not necessarily as much of a curse as we think it is. Because of the distance, I'm able to come at least virtually and meet with you. And I do very much hope that I will be able to see you in person as well, maybe next year in Wuhan. So I very much look forward to that. So what I'm going to do is I have put together a few slides, and I would like to discuss with you some things that currently I'm working on related to causality. And please feel free to interrupt me or ask questions, put your questions in the chat, and we will try to get to them as time permits. So with that, please allow me to share my screen. So today I'm going to be talking about the issue of causality and what happens when causality meets research in information systems. Our field is very diverse. The field of information systems has all kinds of researchers. People use qualitative approaches, people use quantitative approaches, and most of us are trying to get to causality in one fashion or the other in at least some of our projects. So what I'm going to be talking about is based on some work that I'm doing with Professor Andrew Burton-Jones, the EIC of MISQ Quarterly, and a couple of colleagues, Professor Ling Xiu at Georgia State University, and Professor Nina Huang at University of Houston. I've also done some work earlier in the area of causality. I published some of this work in ISR. There are book chapters, also in statistical science. And then I have also published some other work where I have used these concepts in different research papers published in ISR or MIS Quarterly, or sometimes in other journals as well, like Journal of Marketing, for example, or Production and Operations Management. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking about the history and flavors of causality in the information systems field. I will talk about the three dominant views of thinking about causality that have been used in the IS literature. And we believe that these are the three views that have particular promise for IS researchers, particularly those who do quantitative kind of research. And then at the end, I will leave some time for discussion and any open questions. As I said before, we have made presentations on causality to MIS Quarterly editorial board. And after that, we actually made a presentation to more than 400 authors around the world on this particular issue. And at this moment in time, we are putting together an editorial that will appear in MIS Quarterly sometime in September of 2022. So I'm drawing extensively on some of this work that we have already done, and any comments and suggestions will be highly appreciated and acknowledged. Before I get to my talk itself, let me just paint a picture of my own research agenda. Most of my research really looks at the effects of digital resources on firm performance. But I do this work at various levels. It is not only firm level. I also have done research at the level of individuals, at the country level as well, for example. And it is not just showing the effect or impact of digital resources. It is also looking at the mechanisms. How do we explain these findings? How do we explain these effects? And I have been very interested in quantitative methods, but over time, I have also become more open in terms of my methodological toolkit. And I'm collaborating now with other co-authors who have very strong strengths when it comes to qualitative approaches. So I'm trying to now combine quantitative approaches with qualitative approaches, and as they say, to triangulate the reality that we perceive. So that is my broad research agenda here, and maybe I will talk about a little bit more on this. So much of the research that we do, of course, gets published in our top journals, or we try to go there to publish this work. But I've also tried to do over time is try to synchronize my research activities with my teaching activities. So after Professor Patrick Fan told us that we overlapped at University of Michigan, after that, my first job was at University of Maryland, and I was a professor there for about 13 or 14 years, depending on how you count it. And I taught a course, MBA course there, the core course on strategic and transformational IT for a long time in many different formats, including, in fact, I also taught in China a couple of times in Beijing and Shanghai, for example. And I've also taught this course in other countries as well. And during the course of teaching, I basically developed this framework where I think about the three pillars of what I call as digital intelligence. How do we synchronize information technology with strategy? How do we govern IT resources or digital resources? And how do we manage IT projects? How do we bring everything together in practice? And so over time, because I was teaching this course, that also provided inspiration for some of my research. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there is something to be said about creating synergies between different kinds of activities that we do. It is not that we do research in the morning and we reserve our time for teaching in the afternoon, but there is no connection between the two. In fact, one can feed into the other. And that is what I have tried to do in my research program in the last 20 years or so. I also think of myself as a researcher who is somewhat unconventional in the sense that before I started my PhD, I worked for full 10 years in the world of practice. So I used to work for a company called Tata Group, which actually owns Jaguar Land Rover, TCS. I think many of you might be familiar with that, Tata Consultancy Services. You can think of Tata Group as the General Electric of India. So I worked with this group for about 10 years, and then I joined the PhD program at University of Michigan. The interesting thing is that some of my early projects actually came out of the data that I used from the Tata Group. And there was an opportunity for me to write a book on Tata Group's transformation. So when I started my career with the Tata Group back in 1990, this was a group of only $5 billion in revenues. Today, this group has revenues in excess of $100 billion. Now, very few companies on the planet have achieved this feat of going from $5 billion to $100 billion, and that too in traditional domains, like using businesses like steel business, tea business, software business, and not necessarily the platform businesses. So that was an opportunity for me to also, let's say, look at how a business enterprise transformed itself. So I'm showing you here on this slide a book called Making the Elephant Dance. And that basically comes out of my own work experience before PhD, and which I also leverage in my research as well. So just wanted to make this point that the research agenda that I have is not only based on my research activities, but it also draws on my own work experience and also on my teaching activities. And I would make the point that they can potentially feed into each other. Now, coming back to this, over time, I've actually started thinking of my own research program in terms of what I teach in my classroom. So when I think about my research program, I try to think of the 4 bullets on the left-hand side, like where do my research projects really fit in? And here is a summary of what I have tried to accomplish through various research projects. So of course, each of the bullets here might very well be a research paper published somewhere. And I've tried to just present a summary of it. This is how I make sense of my own research program. So if I were to work on a new research project, I would ask myself, where does it fit in my overall research program? And how does it align with my research activities or other kinds of activities that I engage in as a scholar? Now, with that background, let me now turn to today's topic, which is history and flavors of causality. Now, of course, whenever we give a talk, we would like to have a historical background to it. I wish I had started it from Big Bang, but I could not do that. So I'm starting with a quote from about 2,500 years ago. And this is quite an inspirational quote. This comes from Democritus, who was a contemporary of Plato. This is before Christ. And it basically says that I would rather discover one causal relation than be the king of Persia. And in fact, if you think about our own identity as scholars, we are also after some kind of a causal relationship in our research projects. Sometimes we might also be interested in non-causal relationships. Nothing wrong with that. But this is really one of the ultimate tests of science, that can we discover a causal relationship that other people may not consider spurious. So when it comes to causality or the history of causality, this issue has attracted attention of philosophers for a long time. And I showed you the quote in the previous slide, starting 2,500 years ago. And till around, let's say, 1740, again, this is David Hume was a big philosopher, and he made the point that there is no causation outside of human existence. It is we humans who worry a lot about causality. And the point he made was that this is, at the end of the day, only an inference that we make. There is no reality outside of human existence. When we see temporal succession, when we see A followed by B, then we tend to assign A as a cause of B. So that is the temporal succession part. Also, we think that if for A and B to have a relationship, they should be together in time and space. So that is the spatio-temporal contiguity. And every time A happens, if B also happens, then we are more likely to believe that A is the cause of B. So those are some of the ideas that David Hume gave us. But many of these ideas were, highly philosophical, and this continued on for a while. So John Stuart Mill, for example, he was another big philosopher, British philosopher, and he also talked about these methods of agreement, method of difference, concomitant variation, and the method of residue. Unfortunately, many of these methods or many of these discussions that were talked about by philosophers, they were very hard to operationalize. It is only in last 200 years or so that we have developed new technologies or newer ways of thinking about assessing causality. So you can think of regression models, you can think of, let's say, some of the approaches that I'm going to be talking about here, the matching techniques, the potential outcomes approach, the configurational approach. Those things are relatively recent. And I think what I would like to really say here at this moment in time is that when most of us were doing our PhD, maybe 20 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, or 5 years ago, and maybe some of the PhD students are here in the conference, we learned three things related to causality. Number one, we need to establish some kind of an association through correlation. We need to make sure that there is no reverse causality. It is the X that causes Y and not the other way around. It is not that Y causes X. And the third thing we need to do is we need to eliminate all the potential rival hypotheses or all the potential explanations to establish that the relationship that we found is not spurious. So to establish non-spuriousness, we need to think about other potential explanations and rule them out one by one. And that is actually very hard to do unless one is doing experimental research. Most of the time, people who are interested in causality, they tend to have access to what is known as observational data or the data that has already been collected. It is passively collected. And we don't have the luxury of being able to conduct experiments. So then the question arises, how do we establish causality in those kinds of situations? We also learned in our PhD programs, that just establishing association, ruling out reverse causality, or eliminating rival hypothesis is not enough. We also need to come up with some kind of a mechanism, some explanation for why that effect happens in the first place. So there has to be some theory or some mechanism. Of course, there is a recognition that sometimes the theories or exact mechanisms can come later, and it might be sufficient in some domains to just establish causality. So for example, one can think about the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. So people realized that there is a correlation there, and maybe they had a suspicion that there was a strong causality, but they did not necessarily know the exact mechanism. And similar kinds of situations also arise in information systems research as well. So the point of this slide is that there is a lot of literature on causality. Quite a lot of it has been philosophical for many, many centuries. It is only in the last 2 centuries that we have started to grapple with it in a way that is amenable to mathematics, let's say, and we can say some concrete things based on some of the tools and technologies that have been developed. And in particular, I'm going to focus on things that have happened in the last 40-50 years, and then try to bring together 3 different strands of literature. So when we think about causality at this moment in time, there are at least 3 views that are used quite a lot in IS research, but also more broadly in the business research, or you can call it in the research in economics, and even in other fields like sociology, political science, marketing, and so on. The first of these views, we give them a shorthand title called path analytic view. Some people can call it correlational view. There are other names like robust dependence. So different authors call them by different names. But basically the idea here is that we are trying to extract causality from correlations, from covariances. So here, some of the techniques that are used in our literature, people who use structural equation modeling using literal partial least squares. Sometimes they have measurement models and structural models, recursive and non-recursive models, even things like Granger causality, which comes from economics. One could say that this is an example of robust dependence. You are establishing a very strong correlation, and it is hard to know whether we can necessarily assign causality to that or not. Although the word causality appears very, very frequently in the path analytic view. And there are very strong believers in the path analytic view, I mean, including in our field as well. And some people believe that path analytic view helps us to get to the causal mechanisms. So that is one of the advantages of path analytic view. And I put there some of the names of the key people who were involved in development of this so-called path analytic view. So, and you can see there from the citations and the dates, this view is only about 100 years old. So we are in 2022, and the earliest reference I have there is 1918. And this view was used by economists, but also by sociologists and many others. The second view that I have here in the middle is called counterfactual view. One can also call it potential outcomes approach. And this is really the most dominant approach today, at least in the field of economics. In fact, this year's Nobel Prize winners are the ones who use this view quite a lot in their quasi-experimental research. So if you think about David Card, Josh Angrist, and Joshua Imbens, much of their work actually belongs to this camp. And this particular approach draws on Rubin's causal model, which Rubin developed in 1974, but it actually also has an origin in the 1920s, based on the work of Neyman in 1923. Fisher did some work in 1935, and then fast forward to 1970s. So Rubin, Rosenbaum, 1980s. Then there are other economists who have also contributed to this literature. Sometimes in the field of economics, they have also used these notions, but most of the developments related to potential outcomes view or counterfactual view, one could argue that they started to take place in the 1980s, 1990s onwards. And this literature has developed exponentially in the last 20 years, and resulting in this year's Nobel Prize. And finally, there is the third view, which again, we use a label for that. We call it the configurational view. And this view, although it was talked about in philosophical terms by John Stuart Mill in 1882, more philosophical work was done in 1965. And Charles Ragan, he was the one who then developed the ideas in mathematical terms using set theoretic approaches, using Boolean algebra. And he made these ideas far more amenable to mathematics, and using some examples in political science. Then people have started using this approach even in management sciences now. So Pierre Faces, he popularized this technique in Academy of Management Review and AMJ papers. And this literature is also now developing quite a lot in the information systems field. So Professor Omar El-Sawi, Professor Yongki Park, and there are many others who are working on these techniques in the field of information systems. So the point I would like to make on this slide is that there are many different ways and many different approaches of thinking about causality. The word causality is used in all the three approaches, but it means very, very different things. They define causality very differently. They conceptualize causality very differently. Sometimes they use words like counterfactual. Counterfactual word is used in counterfactual view, but it is also used in configurational view, but it has very different meanings altogether. So this is a, I think that these three views, they require a lot of attention, and there is quite a risk of making mistakes if one is not careful enough, because sometimes you will see the same word being used very differently in different domains. I could go maybe one step further and say that it is as if there are three different camps which never talk to each other. There are some attempts that people are trying to make to bridge counterfactual view with the path analytic view, but those attempts are still in very nascent stages. It is as if there are three different galaxies and they have their own solar systems and they have their own planets and their gods, and they will not talk to each other at all. So that is where we see the literature, and that's where we see some of the opportunities where we can bridge the boundaries. And at least as IS scholars, we can, in our own research program, we can try to use different approaches to see if that gives us better ideas or better handle on the problems that we are interested in. This is a heroic effort to illustrate three different views of causality in one slide. So please forgive me if I'm not clear here or I'm being cryptic. But one way of thinking about causal relationships is, let's say, by looking at these box and arrow diagrams. I'm sure many of you are quite familiar and you would have seen such diagrams in MIS Quarterly, ISR, and other journals where we publish our work, right? So if you just take a step back and you focus your attention only on the left-hand side of this diagram, it looks a lot like path analytic view. It looks a lot like a LISREL or PLS-based research model that you might see, right? So where each arrow represents some kind of a causal effect. So that is the path analytic view. In the potential outcomes approach or the counterfactual approach, they don't like, let's say, the path diagrams which are highly complicated. And they will not assign causality to each of the arrows going from F, G, and going from D to Y. They will say that, tell us which causal effect you are interested in, which focal causal effect you are interested in. So they will draw our attention to only the relationship between D and Y, and they will say, well, we can use these other variables to figure out how to establish that relationship, which is denoted by delta in this diagram. So they don't believe in any complicated diagrams where almost every arrow has a coefficient and standard error. They want us to focus on one thing and do that much more rigorously. So that is just a flavor of the potential outcomes or counterfactual view. On the right-hand side of Y, I'm showing you a diagram which is in red. There are two sets. Now, in that, this is the configurational view of causality. And here the key idea is that, in fact, we cannot talk about the effect of D on Y in any meaningful way. Because when we think about causality in the configurational view, they believe that there is not a single cause for almost any outcome that you might care about. Even something as simple as a forest fire does not have a single cause. So for example, I've been to Australia where Professor David Vogel is located. And sometimes when you are traveling on the road, you see some warnings saying that this is a high temperature today, so be careful. There might be fires and things like that, right? So one of the causes of forest fires can be a lighted match. But even a lighted match is not sufficient. It requires dry leaves. It requires presence of oxygen. So the point I'm trying to make here is that even for simple events like fire, there is not one single cause. It is an ensemble or a configuration of causes that we need to think about. So the configurational view basically argues that what you are trying to do in the potential outcomes approach, looking at the effect of D and Y, is a misplaced idea. You should actually be thinking about other things that are also necessary to bring about the effect of D on Y. So this view invokes set theoretic approaches and Boolean algebra to talk about configuration of multiple conditions and then try to see under what conditions a particular causal condition will give rise to an outcome Y that you might care about. What other things might be necessary in addition to D. So I have a little elaboration of the previous slide here on this one, just to make some of these ideas a little bit more concrete and explain them. So first, I would like to draw your attention to the right-hand side of this diagram, which is which makes things a little bit more concrete. So what you will notice here is that it looks very much like a path analytic diagram. And here I'm showing you, let's say, one focal causal effect of some CRM systems on, let's say, firm outcome called profit, right? So in a potential outcomes framework, you will focus your attention on delta. And so in the potential outcomes approach, you will say that, well, in order to estimate that effect, I can think about several approaches for doing that. So one approach is maybe I can close some backdoor paths. So there is some involved literature and specialized vocabulary that is used in the potential outcomes framework, using some of the notation that was introduced by Julia Pearl at UCLA. So one way to estimate this delta is by controlling for these two variables, A and B together, or you can control for F, and that will do the trick. That will basically break the backdoor path between D and Y. So if I control for these two things, or if I control for this in a regression equation, this backdoor path will get closed. And so that is one way to do this. A second way to estimate this delta might be using what is known as an instrumental variable approach. So in this approach, we don't have to worry about all these variables here at the top. Maybe you don't have, you did not collect data on them, or you do not know sufficiently from a theoretical perspective about these variables. Here, the idea is that can we exploit some kind of a natural experiment to estimate this relationship. So if there is an instrumental variable, you can think of, let's say, a Y2K problem that happened in year 2000. Year 2000 was the one when many people were worried around the world that all the computer programs will crash because many of the software developers in the 1970s or 1980s or even in 1960s, when they were writing their code, they had coded year by only 2 digits and not by 4 digits. So they were worried that when we will reach year 2000, the software will think it is 1900 and not 2000. So that came to be known as year 2000 problem. The reason I'm explaining this is because I know that there might be many young people, and sometimes when I teach in my MBA classes, they don't know what Y2K was. So in this situation here, you can exploit the Y2K as a natural experiment that took place. And because of Y2K, it is likely that some firms adopted, let's say, enterprise systems of which CRM was a component. And through that mechanism, we might be able to estimate the effect of CRM systems on firm profits. And the third approach here is, rather than thinking about a backdoor mechanism or a natural experiment, maybe we can think about a front door mechanism. So we can begin to look at the causal pathways. Why CRM systems cause increase in profits? So maybe two mechanisms come to mind. It can happen because CRM systems are helping companies to improve their revenues, or they are helping companies to reduce their costs. And these are the two pathways towards profit, right? So if you can establish these links, that can also be another way to establish this causal relationship of interest. So on the right hand side, you can see there are two things. One is if you look at the diagram as a whole, you can assign causality to virtually every arrow in the path analytic framework. In the potential outcomes framework, they will focus attention on only one of these relationships, and they will try to use these variables to tease out causality that way. Now I would like to draw your attention to the left hand side, which is where I'm showing the configurational approach. In the configurational approach, there are three key ideas. And these ideas are that in this approach, they say that causation is something that is more complex than many people think it is. So there is complex causality. And by complex causality, they mean that you cannot just focus on effect of some D or CRM system on high performance. D will always be there in addition to some other things. It could be IT investments in particular sectors, and I can go on. I can add some more variables here, but for the sake of simplicity, I just put in three conditions here. And they argue that causes are conjunctural. So there is not one cause of any outcome that you might care about. Relationships are always conjunctural. There are always 6 to 8 conditions that need to come together to bring about an outcome. So that is the first concept there. The second concept is the idea of equifinality. So even if you cared about, let's say, high profits, there are multiple ways of achieving high profits. And in this diagram, I'm showing you at least 5 different ways: S1, S2, S3, S4, S5. in the S1 configuration, you can have high profits if you have just these two conditions. But in the S2, you need B, but you don't need D. In the S3, you can have D and B together, and that will give you exactly the same outcome. Only in the S4, IT investments will be sufficient. You don't need to think about CRM or manufacturing at all. And in the S5, maybe this is the only scenario where D alone will bring about high performance. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there are 5 different pathways to high performance, and they are all equifinal. And because of that, it is hard to say whether you should have a CRM system or not, because whether you should have CRM system or not depends on which equifinal way you want to pursue towards high performance. And the third notion that configurational view uses is this idea of asymmetric causation. So for example, I think most of us use regression at one point or the other, which uses this idea of symmetric causation. So in other words, the idea is that if you have CRM systems, that will lead to higher profit if you see a positive relationship, which by implication means that if you don't have CRM systems, you will have lower profits, right? So relationship is almost symmetric. In this particular view, relationships can be asymmetric. So you can have high performance when you have CRM systems, but you can also have not high performance if you have CRM systems if other conditions are true. So in other words, you can have good outcomes if a condition is true, but you can also have bad outcomes when that condition is present. Or even if that condition is not present, that does not mean. So for example, let's say we saw that in this configuration here S4, if A is present, you will have high performance. But and here you see in the not high performance, A is present, and yet you have not high performance, right? So you see symmetry here, but not necessarily here. So I think my guess is this is just an elaboration of the previous slide. And the point I want to make from, let's say, overall discussion here is that these 3 approaches, they differ dramatically in how they conceptualize causation, and also then the kinds of methods they use to approach causality. And I will try to elaborate this a little bit further as I move along one by one. So let me first tackle the path analytic view of causality. And again, this is just showing you some of my published work and some of the diagrams from there. So for example, I wrote a paper in 2011, and this is the paper that actually uses data from the Tata Group, where I worked for about 10 years. And in this paper, we looked at the effect of information management capability on 4 types of 4 dimensions of firm performance: customer performance, financial performance, HR performance, and organizational effectiveness. And we did this using 2 approaches. So one of the approaches, you see 2 coefficients here. So one of the approaches is using Lizrel, which is the path analytic framework. But I also established these relationships using panel models, using random effects methods. And the second coefficient for each of these arrows is coming from that. Now, in most cases, you find that they give you the same results, right? But the way people think about these 2 frameworks are extremely different. And the general idea in the path analytic framework is that we would like to estimate the whole model by itself. So we think of a complex model, and we would like to estimate all these relationships simultaneously, and we would like to assign causality to each of the paths which you see here, right? And this is typically done by looking at the model data consistency. So we have some theory in mind, and our theory says that maybe the relationship should be like this. And if we find support for these relationships in our observed covariances matrices or correlation matrices, then we say, well, we found support for our theory, right? So that is how the path analytic approach works. And there are different versions of path analytic approach. Sometimes people use it using Lizrel models. At other times, they might use, let's say, formative constructs, in which case they might use PLS kinds of models. And then it is possible to complicate these models further. So for example, you might want to, let's say, add some moderators, and you might think about when these relationships are stronger or weaker by considering some moderating effects. At other times, you might have, let's say, nested data. You might have hierarchical data, in which case you can use hierarchical linear modeling techniques. So, for example, I have another paper in Journal of Marketing Research where we looked at the effect of customer satisfaction on shareholder value. And we again had a mediated pathway here going via loyalty intentions, but we were also trying to model heterogeneity through different random coefficients using industry characteristics. So we had industry characteristics, we also had time effects over time, and we were trying to do these moderating effects for each of these mediated pathways. So the models can become very complicated very quickly in the path analytic framework. And I'm sure most of you would have also played with what is known as mediated moderation models, or sometimes people call it mediated moderation models. And in fact, this is a paper that was published in ISR, where it is even more complicated than that. So you can see one mediation here, another mediation taking place. You can think of from pair programming, another mediation taking place here via backup behavior to this, and there is a moderation taking place right here. So the point I want to make from this slide is that the path analytic view has been the workhorse in the information system field ever since its beginning. At least, let's say, MISQ quarterly started in 1970s, ISR started in 1990s, and many of our papers that use a path analytic approach use logic like these: mediation, moderation. Sometimes they might also use hierarchical linear modeling depending on the data structure. And there is nothing wrong in assessing causality using this approach, because some people believe that this approach allows you to talk about the causal pathways. It allows you to build some theories, or at least test your theories, which might have some mediation or some moderation, and see whether you can find support for them in your data or not. Having said that, there are some pros and cons of each of these approaches, which I also want to highlight. So I already talked about these things, that this approach talks about the why questions. It clarifies mechanisms. And in fact, if you read the book by Shardis, Cook, and Campbell, it's an excellent book in 2002, which talks about quasi-experimental approaches. And they make a distinction between two kinds of explanations. So they talk about causal explanation or molecular causation versus causal description or molar causation. So path analytic view, they believe, allows us to talk about individual pathways that result in a particular outcome. Rather than, if you were to use an experimental approach, you can establish some effect, but you will only do using causal description. You cannot pinpoint the exact theory that creates that particular effect in the counterfactual view or using an experimental approach. And I already talked about the model data consistency. One other thing I want to flash here, just to briefly mention here, is that there is some work going on where people are trying to reinterpret this also in the counterfactual causal inference framework, and we can talk about that a little later. At the same time, there are cons. Some people, I think you would have seen some debates in our own journals where people have debated about the right ways or wrong ways of doing structural equation modeling when people are using, let's say, LISREL or even PLS, for example. And some people believe that sometimes the approaches used in the literature can be unprincipled or ad hoc, in the sense that people sometimes just change the arrows to get the right result. It's not very clear whether that is going on or not, but people suspect that. And there can be many plausible alternative models that might give you the same correlations. And sometimes researchers do not consider those plausible alternative models. And then there are also people in other camp, in the counterfactual view, for example, and they believe that there is no way you can assess causality using these covariance based frameworks, because they tend to assign causality only when the researcher is doing some randomization or some manipulation. And in fact, many of the models that you would have seen using path analytic framework, which use survey data or even archival data, researcher is not doing any randomization, or there is no manipulation which is being done with respect to quite a few variables that are being estimated in the same model. So the overall summary of the path analytic view could be that it is useful for theory building and testing. This method was extremely popular. It is still popular in sociology, economics, but there are questions whether this necessarily gets us to causality or not. Okay, so just wanted to say that here. Let me now turn my attention to configurational view. I already foreshadowed some parts of it earlier. So earlier I showed you a research project in MIS Quarterly published in 2011, where I talked about that we were interested in looking at information management capability on firm performance. And these were some of the control variables or other variables that we accounted for. So if you just allow me, I will go back to that slide just to refresh your memory. So just remember this figure. So we estimated this model using path analytic framework, also let's say using panel models. But now in this paper in MIS Quarterly in 2020, we decided to use what is known as the configurational approach to look at the same relationship. So we have those 6 variables here. And the idea is that how do these 6 conditions come together in the form of organizing logics to create equifinal configurations that result in high financial or customer performance versus not high financial, not high customer performance. And the way this approach works is that in the conventional regression approach, you will have these 6 variables. So I'm just using the initials of these 6 conditions. So L for leadership, I for information analytics, S for strategic planning and things like that. So there are 6 variables. In the regression approach, you will estimate each of these coefficients, beta 1 to beta 6. In the configurational approach, you will create sets of these conditions using truth tables. And then you will look at the effect. It is as if we are looking at effect of these sets on this outcome. And as I said before, the underlying mathematics is very different. So the logic for establishing causality here is based on the necessity and sufficiency conditions, which goes back to the work of MISQ and also many other philosophers. In fact, these conditions are also used in Shardish Cook and Campbell book. And the underlying raw material for this is that from your basic underlying data, you create truth tables, which is nothing but a simple way of saying that identify 6 to 8 conditions and then try to look at all the permutations and combinations of those conditions that result in a particular outcome that you might care about. And then you try to minimize your solution using set theory and Boolean algebra. And the notion of causation here is very different. So they use this logic of I-ness condition. So in other words, there is a recognition that it is possible here in this particular approach that no one condition by itself might be sufficient to bring about an outcome, although that condition might be part of other configurations that might be sufficient to bring about causation. So again, these are complex ideas, and I would strongly encourage looking at the original work of Charles Ragan and other methodology textbooks that we have cited in our own papers to get a good understanding of these methods. In the configurational approach compared to the potential outcomes or the path analytic framework, you don't get any numerical coefficients. So you see, this is how the solutions are presented. And these are highly qualitative in nature. So there are no coefficients, there are no standard errors. So we cannot talk about any p-values or t statistics here. In this approach, they do have counterfactuals, but they could talk about counterfactual configurations. And by counterfactual configurations, what they mean is that in the real world, the data that you will have access to, you will not be able to see all the potentials, permutations, and combinations. In other words, there is limited diversity. And in order to make some causal inferences, you will have to think about these counterfactual configurations or the configurations you did not observe and come up with some theory to maybe come up with some directional assumptions to minimize your solutions so that you can come up with results that make sense and that are easy to grasp and easy to explain. So I will probably leave it at that, the difference compared to potential outcomes and the path analytic framework. Once again, similar to the path analytic framework, there are pros and cons of this approach as well. So one of the pros is that this approach is case-centered, in contrast to the variable-centered approach in the path analytic framework and the potential outcomes framework. So the argument here is that we would like to retain the identity of the particular cases that you have in your data, so that you can do some dialogue with the data. So for example, if you are working with, let's say, so when I do my research, sometimes I will have, let's say, 4,000 observations. Sometimes I might have 4 million observations, depending on the kind of data that you are handling. And the relationship that you estimate at the end of the day, it is very hard to pin down those relationships to individual data points in the potential outcomes approach. And that is also true in the path analytic framework. In the configurational approach, where you can work with limited sample sizes, you can actually talk about specific cases that exhibit a particular configuration. So that is the part which talks about the dialogue with data, which allows you to do some richer theorizing that you will not be able to do in other kinds of approaches. So this approach models causal complexity. We talked about some of these ideas, and some people argue that you can come up with some prescriptive recipes which are very easy to communicate to the managers. So for example, if I go back to my previous slide here, and if I am talking to a healthcare manager, I can tell him that if you care about high financial and customer performance, there are 4 ways of achieving that. And depending on your initial conditions, you can pick any one of these 4 different pathways. It is not that you have to have, let's say, customer focus in all the situations. For example, you notice in this configuration, I don't need customer focus, and yet I can have high financial and customer performance. Likewise, you don't need to have high HR capability in this configuration here. So the point I'm trying to make here is that this approach allows you to communicate with managers by talking 4 different recipes for achieving high financial and customer performance. There are some cons as well. So the conclusions are dependent on researchers' expertise and choices about calibration and counterfactual cases, their choices of them. So if you are using configurational approach, or if you're reading papers that are using configurational approach, you need to have a lot of confidence in the expertise of researchers that they did the right way of, they did the right calibration to achieve their results that they are documenting in the paper. Conclusions are very qualitative. And some people also argue that the method has limited generalizability because all conclusions are strictly limited to the data that you have in your sample. So you cannot make any claims about external validity or generalizability, although I don't believe that this is a serious concern with this approach, because that is an issue that also applies to other approaches as well. Because most of the time we have a sample, and in many cases, we don't have a random sample, almost never. Most of the time we are working with the samples which one could argue are non-representative of underlying populations. So this approach compared to other approaches is relatively nascent, but in the information systems community, we have seen already quite a few papers, and people argue that this approach allows you to do come up with richer theories or come up with richer kinds of explanations, which are hard to do in other approaches which are meant for theory testing or for verifying existing theories. Finally, let me now turn my attention to the potential outcomes or counterfactual view. And here, let me just try to give a motivating example of that. And this is in honor of Professor Doug Vogel, who is in Australia. So this is how one of the philosophers thought about the counterfactual view. Like again, Lewis was thinking in terms of philosophical considerations. So this is a statement which comes from his book. If kangaroos had no tails, they would topple over. So when we think about the counterfactual view of causality, we are imagining parallel universe. So if you go to Australia, you will find kangaroos there. and you will notice that they have tails most of the time, and they walk fine. And a counterfactual view would be that, and you are wondering what happens if they don't have a tail? What if they are born without tails? Now you will have to imagine a parallel universe in which there are kangaroos. They don't have tails, and maybe you will see them upside down. Then you can say that the causal effect of tail is in maintaining stability of kangaroos in keeping them straight, right? A more serious example could be, let's say this comes from the work of statisticians Rubin and Holland. If John Doe had been born a female, his life would have been different. Here you are thinking about just making a change in the gender of an individual. So you are imagining a parallel universe. So John Doe is exactly the same John Doe. Instead of John, he's Jane in the parallel universe. And you are wondering what would be his or her life outcome in these two parallel universes, so that I can simply compare the effect of gender on the life outcomes. An IS example would be, had a firm with CRM not adopted CRM, what is the likelihood of its performance being worse or being better? Again, we are imagining a parallel universe. So you, in the real world, you will see a firm either with CRM or without CRM. And you are asking yourself the question that, keeping all things constant, in a parallel universe, there is this other situation, whether this firm does not have CRM. Do I see customer satisfaction performance that is worse or it is better? So this is the approach that is motivated in the counterfactual view of causality. And it is implicitly used in the randomized experiments. So I'm not going to go through this slide, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of how this approach really works. Okay. In the potential outcomes approach, there is a belief that on every individual, so supposing you are thinking about John Doe or Jane Doe, you think that there are two potential outcomes on their forehead. So you can observe a person, supposing I'm a male, you can, because I'm a male, you can see my, just by my looks here, you will see my outcomes as a male. But there is another outcome associated with me had I been a female that you don't observe. So there is no way you can calculate for me an individual causal effect. What would my life outcome be if I were a female, or vice versa if you are a female, right? So there is no way one can assess causality at the individual level. And this is known as a missing data problem, because you cannot observe the same individual in two states at the same time. So I've done some research looking at the effect of MBA on people's compensation. The problem is, in the real world data that you will get, you will see people either with an MBA and what their compensation is, or you will see people without MBA and what their compensation is. You will never have the data on the same individual when he has an MBA, what his compensation or salary is, and on the same individual data if he did not have an MBA, right? So there is no way to compute individual causal effect for any individual ever. Now, realizing that this is a missing data problem, scientists sometimes change their research question and they say, well, I cannot calculate effects at the individual level, so can I calculate effects at the group level? So then they change the research question and they begin to talk about average causal effect. And that is what is done in the experiments. We do some randomization, we create a treated group and we create a control group, and we believe that these two groups are almost similar except in the treatment that you assign to the treated group, which allows you to compute the causal effect by just looking at the mean differences. That situation is not true if you don't do randomization. So as a result, there are two kinds of biases that can arise. There can be a baseline bias, which is basically that the people in the treatment group, even in the untreated group, they might be smarter than the people in the control group. So that is one thing that you worry about. And the second thing is people are assigning themselves to the treatment. So those who are going to benefit from MBA or CRM systems, they will go into that treatment, and those who think that they will not benefit, they will not go into that treatment. So that will create selection biases, which have implications for your causal effect estimation. And those are the problems that are solved in the potential outcomes or econometric approaches by using conditioning, instrumental variable approaches, front door mechanisms, using panel data sometimes, using fixed effects, difference in differences, regression discontinuity, and there is a whole lot of alphabetical soup here that people are now beginning to use in many of the published papers in ISR, MIS Quarterly, and other top journals in the field. And if you cannot do point identification, then people resort to sensitivity analysis or set identification. Now, there are relatively few papers that have actually used this third approach here. So in the interest of time, I will just skip ahead and go to my, let's say, concluding slides. So the point I want to make through these slides, and I'll be happy to send these slides out to you. The idea is that each of these approaches within the potential outcomes or counterfactual approaches, they have their own set of assumptions. And under those restrictive assumptions, you can assess or you can attribute causality to one causal effect that you might care about. Okay. And they help you to also deal with these two problems of the baseline bias and the differential treatment effect bias. So among the pros and cons of the potential outcomes approach, you can only investigate effect of one intervention at a time on a particular outcome that you might care about. The findings are easy to communicate if you follow the more recent work in this literature, but people consider some cons also of this approach, which is that it estimates very narrow relationships, focuses on very narrow causal questions, not appropriate for theory building, but appropriate for testing some of the theories, or maybe at least giving you some magnitude of the so-called causal effect, if you believe in the underlying assumptions of each of these approaches. So this is a fairly sophisticated area and rapidly evolving literature. And as I said before, that this year's Nobel Prize was given to the people who actually work in this particular space. Now, let me just compare very quickly the three approaches and their salience for the information systems field. So this is our take, and this is what we are going to put in the editorial as well, that if you think about these three approaches, they have different applicability in terms of the range of questions or the range of domains to which they apply. So path analytic, it used to have a big market share in terms of published papers, and maybe it will continue to have. And the reason is because it can handle a variety of questions. Configurational, not so much, and here potential outcomes, the range of questions are relatively narrow. These two approaches are, this approach is more suited to explanation, while these approaches are more for causal description, relative contribution to building theories, types of interventions. You can handle many types of interventions. Although some people argue that here also you can handle continuous interventions, but it becomes harder to interpret them. The data requirements are also quite significant in the potential outcomes approach, not so much in the configurational approach. And here you can work with many different kinds of data and moderate sample sizes. Okay, so that leads to the next question. Is any one view better compared to the other? And maybe I will get to that a little later. But I wanted to show you this slide where we are making an argument that different approaches might be better suited for the kinds of questions that you have in mind. And sometimes, depending on the view that you take of causality, you might be motivated to frame your research questions differently. And sometimes, your questions dictate the choice of methods, but vice versa is also true. Depending on which method you commit to related to causality, that will also change the questions that you are allowed to pose or you can pose. So here are some questions that came to my mind, and I'm happy to talk about them, but I would like to leave some time for questions. So I will just stop sharing my screen and maybe take your questions and comments in the remaining time.
Thank you, Sunil, for this wonderful presentation. And for the audience, feel free to enter your questions through the chat. So if you have any questions would like Professor Mithas to answer, just enter your question through the chat. Or if your microphone is enabled, feel free to ask your questions.
Well, I'd like to thank him very, very much. Actually, this is very helpful to me. I teach research methods, and having this kind of presentation is very helpful. So thank you very, very much. I will also personally testify that our kangaroos, the kangaroos in my backyard, don't completely topple over. They actually run with their tails up and just using their feet. But you're right, if they're trying to defend themselves or whatever, then they use the tail. So it's a mix. It's a mix, and it's like you say, it's an interesting research question indeed. I'm trying to mentally envision how that might work. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much for your kind comments.
Sunil, there's a question from the chat. Ask you like how to determine the frequency cutoff in FSQCA. I don't even know what that means.
Yeah, I think each of the literatures have their own specialized vocabulary. So frequency cutoff is how many cases or how many, let's say, in the truth table, how many instances you need to have for each of the rows. So I think this is an issue that is sample dependent or data dependent. If you have, let's say, a sample size of only 30, then you don't have the luxury. Maybe frequency cutoff can be 1. But if you have a sample size of 300, then now you have luxuries and you can say, well, I will have a frequency cutoff of 3 or maybe 2. Also, I think one thing, those who do this research, they know that you also have to look at the plausibility of the configurations you get. So sometimes people, make these decisions in an iterative fashion. Like you look at the solution and you ask yourself, does it make sense? And if it does not make sense or if it is too complicated, then you change the cutoff. So sometimes these things are iterative and situation dependent. But thank you very much. This was a great question. And this also brings to fore this idea that how much of reliance is there or how much of trust has to be there in the researcher's expertise, that people are doing things in a way that makes sense. And you can trust their domain knowledge and their justifications for why they settled on particular frequency cutoffs or particular thresholds. Okay, I think the next question I see here is from Jen Zhu. Would you talk a little bit more about how configurational analysis works on endogeneity? So endogeneity, the way economists think about this issue, unfortunately, in the configurational approach, they don't think about these issues in the same manner. They in fact they don't even have a phrase for it. So, and they use very different. So as I said, it is as if each of these camps uses their own specialized language. And I think as I said earlier, there is some debate between people who follow configurational approach and people who use, let's say, potential outcomes approach. There is some back and forth. So some people have criticized configurational approach, saying that by using your calibrations, you are making some arbitrary decisions, and you are also not taking into consideration some of the issues that we talked about earlier related to endogeneity, like you should not have bad controls or things like that. But then configurational people argue back to the potential outcomes guys, and they say that you guys are looking at very trivial questions. You believe that it is only the effect of D on Y is all that you should care about. But we know in the real world, things happen in configurations, right? So these debates are not yet settled. And people, they talk past each other all the time. So that's a great question. And the answer is that these two communities don't talk to each other. And good luck to you if you are using a configurational approach and the reviewers are coming at you from endogeneity side. It is very hard to reconcile or very hard to address their viewpoints, because then you will have to go to a different world to solve the endogeneity concerns. So we don't have a good answer to this question that you asked, and we hope that if you are doing work on using FSQCA, then they are just by FSQCA standards rather than by potential outcomes standards. Okay, next question. If you are an early stage researcher, which one should you focus on? Well, you should focus on depending on which questions you would like to ask. So I showed you one slide that depending on which causality view you subscribe to, that limits or constrains the kinds of questions you can pose, right? So if you care about some questions that can only be asked by using potential outcomes approach, then good luck to you. You should follow that approach. On the other hand, if the questions that you care about, you think configurational view of causality makes a lot of sense, then you should go there. Having said that, in general, sometimes, these things have different connotations. It is hard to, let's say, master the potential outcomes approach. So during the PhD training, I would say, go for doing harder things. So try to understand how potential outcomes view works. But if you have time, you can also learn other methods. And ideally, over time, you would like to learn all the methods. Okay, I think one last question I see here is that, can we integrate these views of causality? I think that will be a very risky adventure, because if you try to combine these three things in one paper, you can anticipate receiving three kinds of objections, and there is no way you will ever achieve convergence. So my best advice will be to follow one view of causality and hope that you get the editors and reviewers who belong to that view and who are willing to judge the paper by those standards. But over time, in your research program, you can have multiple papers using different approaches, and that might be a safer strategy, just as a safer strategy, I would say, for almost anybody, unless you want to take risks. I think the one other question I see here is from Fen, which is, how do I know which conditions I need to include in configurations? And that's a great question. And the answer is, it depends on your domain knowledge, your understanding of the prior literature. So what are the causal conditions that the prior literature has argued brings about that particular outcome that you care about? So for example, when I told you about forest fire, people know that dry leaves matter, lighted match can be an explanation, lightning can be another reason for that, moisture conditions in the atmosphere can be another condition, right? So you can think of these causal conditions that the literature has talked about and certainly consider them. One limitation of this method is you cannot consider more than 6, 8, maybe 10. It starts to become very complicated. So we hope that you can exercise your domain knowledge and expertise to convince the reviewers that, look, these are the 6 things that matter. There might be a dozen others, but they are not as consequential. So let us focus on these 6. The one question I have from my, let's say, keynote speaker, Professor Ping Wang, is, do the 3 views of causality reflect people's different epistemological views? The answer is, it's hard. I mean, the thing is, some of these views came from, let's say, philosophy. They have underlying ideas from different philosophers. And one could argue that maybe they might have different epistemological views. So I think I'll have to think about this question a little bit more. Do they all belong to positivism epistemology? I'm not sure. I will have to think more about it. That is an excellent question. I think I can answer that question in a very narrow sense, and the way I try to do that in the presentation. If you look below the hood, they think about causality in very, very different terms, right? So I'm aware that there are also people also look at causality using case study research, for example. There is critical realist view, for example. So that is a very different epistemological view compared to, let's say, positivism epistemology, right? But to answer this question more completely will require much more thinking, and maybe there is a paper right there to bring them together and talk about different views that might be undergirding these different approaches.
All right. In the interest of time, thank you, Sunil, for giving us this wonderful, keynote speech. Let's give him a big round of applause for him.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.